I think this speaks to me about the three types of relationships that all of us are always in. And it's the relationship to ourselves. Number one, how do we think about and feel and behave towards ourselves? What I'm saying is the core work of leadership is to get into right relationships with ourselves first so that we can have great relationships one on one with people, right? With individuals, other individuals that we work with, and then have a great relationship to the team or to your organization as a whole. And so relationships are fractal in that way. And as leaders, it starts with shifting the relationship to yourself, one other, and then to a team, and then to an organization. And I think it's important to talk about that. And I think in many businesses, people understand their relationships are important, but don't really have any strategies or mechanisms for how to work on that, how to improve that, how to shift that when you're not in right relationship with either yourself or others that you're working with. And I think that's the core of what we offer in the work that we do.
Hi there, my name is Duncan Autry, and you are listening to Fractal Friends, the podcast where we explore our self-similarity across our diversity. We all have a role to play in the whole, and the purpose of Fractal Friends is interview people with interesting perspectives on the world and see what it is that we can learn from one another. In this episode, I talk with Alla Weinberg. Alla is my business partner. We are the co-founders of Spoken Wheel. We started our company a year ago in August of 2019, right after Alla's first visit to Fractal Friends. Alla is an executive leadership coach, and I am a conflict transformation catalyst. And together, we call ourselves the Workplace Relationship Experts. In this conversation, we talk about our vision of a future of work where people are excited about the work that they get to do and are nourished by the people that they get to work with. We talk about how teams, companies, and organizations are constantly navigating a balance between the interdependent polarities of power and love, and how they become generative when they can strike a balance between being productive and effective on one hand and inspire a sense of connection and belonging on the other. We talk about Alla's new book, A Culture of Safety, and consider the essential ingredients for creating a safe and trusting team. And we talk about practical strategies that leaders can take to create and transform culture. And we talk about complex systems theory and spirituality and crochet. This episode fits nicely into season 3 because it shares practical and inspirational ways that we can transform culture and work together to build a world that works for all of us while being effective and productive and while caring for one another. Thank you for listening to Fractal Friends. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening to it and give it a review. And also come visit fractalfriends.us where you can get more information about all the things that we discuss in this episode. And there on the episode page, you can get resources from Spoken Wheel and learn more about our work. And I also encourage you to check out the archive of Fractal Friends that now has over 50 episodes. I'm also excited to say that it is now possible for you to support Fractal Friends. You can make a donation through PayPal, or you can become a patron of Fractal Friends through Patreon, where you can subscribe to make a monthly contribution to this project. And if you do decide to become a patron, you will receive goodies from me, and I'll give you access to exclusive content. You can find buttons to make contributions and donations on the episode page at fractalfriends.us. And of course, as you heard, I am professionally dedicated to helping the world improve its capacity to communicate across our differences. This episode is a deep introduction to Alla's and my work as Spoken Wheel. If you like what you hear, come check us out. We offer free initial calls at our website, spokeandwheel.co. That's spokeandwheel.co. And now let's go down with the show. This episode is recorded in August of 2020. And now, please enjoy my conversation with Alla Weinberg. Alla, thank you so much for being back on Fractal Friends. It is so good to be talking to you in this context.
I'm so happy to be back. Thank you for having me.
You were a guest. Episode went out August of last year. And what was amazing is that immediately after that conversation, or within a day or so, we decided to become business partners. We had been working together, as colleagues and so forth, but we decided to be business partners, and we started a company called Spoken Wheel, and it's been around for a year now. So congratulations.
Congratulations to you. Woohoo! We made it a year.
Yeah, it's been really a powerful experience for me. One of the things that was really meaningful to me and coming into like business partnership, initially was to really allow myself to just like focus on something and to really believe,
Mm.
because like doing conflict transformation, I was just like, well, if you're a human, there's probably something I can help you with. And that's great, but it's not really easy to market. And it's like, and then, so like focusing on like teams and organizations and businesses, it's like, wow, this is actually like where that, do you know the Ikigai concept?
I do,
Yeah.
yes.
So what is it? It's like, what is your passion, your skills, what's going to make you money, and what the world needs. Like,
Yeah.
yeah. And so that's exactly where this is. This is like our Ikigai, right? It's like,
Yes.
but the thing that's been really meaningful to me also is to recognize that like being in partnership is also about bringing our full selves and really recognizing that this is in a way like this is like a lifetime thing. I mean, eventually maybe we'll move on or we'll sell it, or who knows what. But in the meantime, it's like it's a very special kind of relationship, and I just like, want to say I'm really grateful to be in this relationship with you.
Oh, thank you, Duncan. I feel the same way. And I feel that, given that our business is so relationship based, being in a relationship together doing this business is so important. And I feel both of us have transformed a lot over the last year as a result of this partnership, this business partnership, and the relationship that we have with each other.
Yeah, I know that. Like, I mean, I've grown a lot. One of the things that's been really powerful was like not too long ago that we had this like kind of powerful conversation about like really recognizing our strengths and what is playing to what we're like really good at.
Mm.
And that was really meaningful to me because one, well, first of all, we have like really great complementary strengths, with
I know it's so lucky.
yeah. And that's like a good part of like making a good team is making sure that you have all the different things on the, all the different elements in play. But it was really meaningful to me to kind of give myself permission to like play to my strengths and to really let them shine and to think about like how can we actually change what we do or how we do it in order to work for me, and
Yeah.
that's I think really an interesting piece is, and this will probably end up being like a theme across this whole conversation is like, how does the organization influence the individuals, and then how the individuals influence the organization? But anyways, just to like, I don't know, get things going, like, why don't you tell us a little bit about sort of, because this was originally sort of like your spark, and this was like a dream that you really wanted to fulfill, and you invited me to join you with. Why don't you tell us a little bit about sort of like how you got here and how you got to this dream?
I think it's a bit of a winding road, to be honest,
That's always true.
as all
Yeah.
things are, right? um, I guess I find myself to be a creative person. I've always had a lot of ideas, and I've always been entrepreneurial, but there was never an idea that I really felt was mine to execute, to hold dear to my heart. I thought the ideas were cool, but they were never my thing. And when I hit upon Spoken Wheel and really focusing on helping people have better relationships at work and really approaching the world just from that lens, from that perspective, not only did it feel different to me than everything that I've seen out there, but it felt like, oh, this is the one I meant to carry forth in this world, to bring about, to do the work in. And I guess it was a much more of an intuitive kind of feeling. And, it also stemmed from my experiences in the workplace where I didn't find them to be terribly caring, or honestly, I'm just going to go and say loving again. And I feel like people deserve more love at work, not less. And we spend an average person spends 90,000 hours at work over their lifetime, which is doing more than anything else in your life. You're spending more time at work than doing anything else in your life. And I personally really wanted that experience to feel nourishing, to feel loving, to feel meaningful and fulfilling. And I want to help create that for other people too. Like I have experienced it, but very rarely in the workplace. And I want that to be the norm, like to be the regular thing.
I mean, it's such a powerful, vision, that one. And I remember in the last time we spoke on the podcast, you said something that was really, really moving, which was like, imagine getting to the end of your life. And generally people will say, like, no one says, like, oh, I wish I had worked more.
Yeah.
But like, what if people got to the end of their life and maybe didn't necessarily say, like, I wish I had worked more, but said, like, I am so grateful for like all of the time I got to be like co-creating something awesome with amazing people that loved me and cared for me and that I got to like be in relationship with.
Yeah.
I've also been, wrote that piece recently about like the vision for 2030 and, like thinking about like what work looks like. And it's like, not only do we want this to be a place where people are feeling loving and they're like feeling joyful, but there's also this aspect of like, we all knew that our work was like doing something really good for the world. And we all recognize that. And in a way, we're like grateful to each other for that. Being able to say like, wow, thank you for what you're doing in this world. And I'm glad that you're there. And, whatever it is, like I remember feeling so grateful of being in like an airport once and just being like, thank you so much for making food for me while I'm on a layover in this town, like the person was having a miserable day. And I was just like, just try to like beam them with gratitude for just like
Right.
doing something that I couldn't do and I needed someone to do for me. And I wanted to let her know like this is like a gift that she's doing.
Yeah. And I think it just has ripple effects to our families, to our communities, right? Like if people are filled up at work instead of drained, if they feel like work is meaningful, that their contribution is doing something really good for the people around them in the world, they're going to come home and, they're going to have a lot of love to give to their family and back to their community. And I guess in my small way, this is how I want to change the world.
Yeah. And it's so needed. And, and it's a massive way to change the world because, I mean, it's interesting how like just even the idea, like just the word work almost has like a negative implication, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh man, I've been working a lot these days, and it's like that person's not saying like, whoa, I am so jammed about all the things I'm doing necessarily.
I guess my hope is that the work, like through our work together, that the word work will start to become synonymous with joy. That's what I want.
Yes, please. I was actually listening to this podcast called Teamistry, and it's done by a lassie, and and the episode I was listening to is called The Wizards at Menlo Park, and it was about Thomas Edison. And, we think about Thomas Edison and the light bulb, but like not only did he like not really invent the light bulb, he just improved it. But it wasn't just him that improved it. And one of the things that they made this point of is that like it wasn't like they invented the light bulb or even the electrical grid, but that he invented how teams work together. Like he got together this amazing team of all these different skills, machinists and electricians, like there weren't even electricians yet, but like whatever, chemists and all these different people with all these different skill sets. And he got them in this giant room, all interacting with each other and like doing things together. One of the things that was like really powerful was in this shared workspace, he also really helped people like emphasis on like what their ability was, not necessarily what their title was. And so as people had interests on different things, they were encouraged to sort of get involved with different pieces. And he even like did a lot of things where he was like, he recognized like, look, if you're the one who's good at this, like you tell me what to do, like making suggestions and all this. But he also had them all have lunch together and they all like, brought beer in and they all like hung out together because he also recognized that it was the time when they were not working, but being in relationship that like a lot of magic happened. But one of the things that I really enjoyed, this person was writing a letter home about like their experience of working there. And he says that the work was both strenuous and joyous. And I'm like, oh, Like, that's amazing. Like, how many people get to write home about their work life and say, like, wow, I'm working really hard and I'm having so much fun. I enjoy this.
I want that to be the norm. I want folks to be able to say that about their work. And what this brings up for me is something I've been thinking a lot about, which is companies nowadays often want to hire the best talent, which I understand, like the most talented, the smartest, the people with the most experience. They want to attract those kinds of people. They want to hire those kinds of people. But what folks are missing, I think, is understanding that you can hire the best people, but you're not going to get the results you want unless all those people work well together. And all of the work that we're doing now currently in the world, you have to do it together with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's actually how those people relate to each other, how they work together, that makes much more of a difference to businesses than the individual talent or intelligence or experience itself, just by itself. So it's that collective, that team, that it makes that magic, that has that intelligence.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, like, yeah, you can have a bunch of smart people and they need to work together. And you can't just, like, put them all in the same, space and then just be like, go do it. There's something about how you have to, like, actually create the culture that will make that happen. And this is, like, kind of part of the role of leader. And, and something, of course, that your new book that should be coming out soon that you've written, The Culture of Safety, like, really talks about this. And I actually love that it's like called Culture of Safety, building an environment for people to think, collaborate, and innovate. And, like, one might not recognize that, like, having the space feel safe and trusting and having there be, like, a very special culture there is what helps those people begin to be able to think and collaborate and innovate. And I think this is, like, speaks to, like, I think one of our core philosophies, and something that's been really important to us is, like, it's like that balance between, we talk about, like, the power between power and love, and that we've, like, adapted in politics definitions of power and love, and we have them now as, like, power is this drive to act, to achieve a life-affirming purpose, and to realize an impact in the world. And then, like, love is this drive to integrate and unite with each other in service of what the world needs. And that we need both of those to both be able to feel like we're connected and collaborating and communicating, and where there's, like, a diverse set of people with great minds. And then that is what gets the organization to be able to make money, get things done, be powerful, be creative, be innovative, and that those things are in a dance with each other. And then the thing that I think is why, like, the idea of, like, thinking about relationships is so powerful is because, like, relationships is what connect all these amazing individuals in service of that higher life-affirming purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about power and love, these dimensions, as a polarity. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about that. What is a polarity, and how we're thinking about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, this is one of my favorite things to talk about. So
I know, that's why I'm like, Duncan. And I think it's a very different perspective that we're holding here than what has, been out in the world so far. And so I think it's important for us to touch upon that and say, this is the lens through which we're looking at the world, and how we work with our clients and help you see the world through this way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it definitely cuts across all of our work, and it is, yeah, it takes a moment to explain, but I think people can feel it intuitively, So if the idea about a polarity, and specifically an interdependent polarity, is that both sides of the polarity are important and they give each other meaning, and when held together, they become generative because they're both supporting each other. But when one chooses to sort of focus on just one or the other, it tends to become degenerative or destructive. So there's a whole lineage here on this, like, power and love piece, where, like, Paul Tillich was a theologian who first identified this as, like, a drive of living beings. Martin Luther King studied this for his seminary thesis, and he said it really well. He says, power without love is reckless and abusive, while love without power is sentimental and anemic. And so while a lot of organizations might look at an organization and say, one might even think that what we would do is like we go into an organization and say like, wow, you all are focusing on like profit and getting things done, but you're losing track of like the human relationships. And so let's help you figure out how to communicate and collaborate and play and have more fun. And so this becomes like this linear solution. So someone's going to go towards, let's just go towards more love or connection and unity. And one might find the resistance to that because if we like only focus on everyone just having a good time and feeling really comfortable, and we go too far on that, then we might actually lose track of becoming a profitable, effective business, achieving things. Now, of course, if you find an organization, which I know some of too, where everyone's so focused on everyone feeling so comfortable and just like making sure that everything feels really safe and good and everyone's all connected and relating, like, and that's a main focus, you might lose track of power and like actually getting things done. And you could actually, in a way, like destroy a culture of a place by just saying like, let's all focus now on productivity. So what happens is these things have to be in balance with each other. And part of that balance is finding, one, that they both have like a shadow side and a positive side. And that the negative things of like too much connection or too much love are solved by the positive qualities of power, while the negative qualities of power are solved by the positive qualities of love. And so what you want to do is you want to get your organization to be a place where it's like kind of constantly sort of like balancing back and forth in between these. And again, we can see this happening in good organizations, like those, like the Thomas and Edison team. It was just like they have like a serious goal and they know what they're trying to accomplish and they have a checklist. And they also are all in relationship and communicating and talking with each other about how they can accomplish whatever they're trying to accomplish, and making sure that they're relating to each other and trusting each other and sharing the work. You know, so they're saying like we did it. And so, you know, this is, you know, the piece when we're like, you know, where it shows up with our work is like we have our like team relationship assessment tool, and what it does is we've broken down like power and love into these different like dimensions. And then we like are actually trying to capture like how much is the negative quality of this showing up in your organization? How much is the positive quality? And then we're able to sort of like map it as a way to show like, wow, it seems like you're really getting a lot of the good stuff out of power and a lot of the negative qualities of love. Or maybe, you know, we can sort of help them sort of see where they are in like that dynamic flow and help them sort of recognize like what is the way of finding that balance.
And I love how you describe it as a dance, because it's never you're done, right? You're, you know, even if we come in and help as spoken wheel, help you rebalance it, that's just the beginning of the dance. You constantly have to reflect, you know, how are we doing on each dimension? Are we still balanced? What needs to get rebalanced? And then it's a very active undertaking. It's not something that you're like, okay, check, done, we're good. We can rest on our, you know, we can rest now. There's nothing to do here anymore. That is a constant work in progress, a constant rebalancing. Just like if you're driving a car, you know, you're constantly even micro adjusting the wheel so that you're driving straight, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is the same. Like hopefully we can help organizations get on the road, start to drive straight, help, you know, rebalance some of those axles or whatever that might be out of balance. But as the organization continues forward and drives, you still have to make sure to continue to adjust the steering wheel so that you're headed in the direction that you're wanting to go. And so you can't just take your hands off and be like, okay, we're good, we're heading straight, because the road tends to wind and we need to keep up with that.
Absolutely. And yeah, I really do try to think about this as this dance. You know, like I'm always trying to figure out different ways to talk about conflict, which where I'm not actually saying the word conflict because people tend to, no one wants that. But, you know, that tension between like, you know, do we get things done or do we enjoy doing it? There's a conflict there, but we could think about it more as like a dance or a tension or a dynamic, you know, balancing. And yeah, there's like always this correcting that's happening, which is part of why we think about like another thing I think that we do that's maybe different than other organizations that work with businesses is we're really thinking about how can this create a sustainable change. Like, it's not just about coming and teaching someone something and then leaving. It's like we really see like the best way for us to work with organizations and companies and teams is to do like a program where we actually work with them over a period of time to help them not only learn kind of all the different facets of a thing, but also make sure that each individual is like learning the piece, but then also learning in their culture how they want to be making that change. Or not just like, or how they can continue to be doing that change, right? Like we want to make sure that the skills are something that can be going forward, because nothing is an immediate fix. We don't want any organization to be static.
And I think this is why we offer a combination of coaching, training, and facilitation work, because no single modality is going to create that sustainable change within an organization. And what we do is we create custom programs that have a mix of training, have a mix of coaching, have a mix of facilitation to help people learn actually how to relate to each other differently and do that on a long-term basis, so that that habit of relating actually sticks. And I define culture as an emergent property that arises out of how people relate to each other. And then I think even the word relate, what does that even mean? I think a lot of folks, we use that word, well, how are you relating to that? What kind of relationship are you having? But we don't often know what even we're saying when we say that. And I think of relationships and relating as how you think, feel, and behave towards another person. And what we do is we shift that, and shifting how we think, how we feel, how we behave towards each other in a sustainable way, in a permanent way, in effect changes the culture, because culture arises out of those relationships around how we think, feel, and behave around each other.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, exactly. And I think it's just like, it's, with like the like training, facilitation and coaching, there's about like helping inspire individual change, helping change the systems. Like we think about like, how do we change like the way you have your meetings? And then also, giving people the lived experience on how to have a different way of relating, and then teaching them how to have a different way of relating.
Mm-hmm.
And, you talk about this, and then like something emerges out of this. I wonder if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about emergence and because I think that that's a term that maybe people will hear, but maybe don't totally understand. Or why don't you just tell us a little bit about emergence?
What is emergence? I'm just trying to think what's the most accessible way to talk about that. So when I think of emergence, I literally think of something arising out of, in my head, I literally imagined like something arising, like literally coming up out of different parts. So when I talk about culture being an emergent property, what I mean is you can't look at specific individuals and say, oh, this person has this skill set, and this person has this skill set, and this person has this experience. And this is the culture we're going to have because we have these three people with these skills and personalities. You can't set that yet. But what you can do is, put those people together, and the relationships that they have with each other will start to create the culture. So if they're competitive with each other, you're going to have a more competitive culture. If they're more collaborative with each other, then you're going to have a collaborative culture. So it's something that gets co-created in the interaction of things or people. And so it's not something that you can make happen. It's not something that you can check off that list. It's not something you can force, but it's something that literally gets, I almost want to, like, I'm not sure how to, maybe you can help me, Duncan. I'm not sure how to approach this in a way that makes sense.
One of the ways that I think about this, and this is, I think, one of the things that was like fun, there was a cool overlap of ours is, I watched a talk of yours that you did where you're talking about like murmurations of these like flocks of birds, like all flying together in this like beautiful, beautiful patterns. And then of course, like fractals is like my, jam. And what happens with like a fractal or a murmuration, these are all kind of considered different forms of complex systems. And what's going on is that there's basically like the repetition over a large group of following a certain culture or way of relating or way of being in relationship, like that quality of that in a self-organizing system creates like a bigger pattern that's somewhere beyond that. And an example that I use sometimes, I learned to actually watch this like TED Talk a while ago about the discovery of this like mathematical model through crochet projects. These women were crocheting these coral reefs to tell people about climate change. And a mathematician was invited to come help out because they were just trying to crochet like millions, thousands of things. They just needed someone to help and do something. And this mathematician was like sitting there because her sister was teaching her how to crochet something. And she's like, holy smokes, we just made a model for hyperbolic space. And people have been trying to figure out if hyperbolic space even existed for centuries. And I was like, that sounds fun. I'm going to learn how to do that. So I ended up getting into crocheting. And what happens is you're just doing like stitch, a certain stitch, a certain stitch, and certain stitch. And then you just make a very, very slight change in how you do the stitch. And then the whole shape of the thing changes. And so I like to think about this with like an organization or a team is like you have a team that in a way like might not be functioning at its best or maybe is dysfunctional. You don't need to change the whole team and like fire everyone or anything like that. If you could make a tweak in how those people are relating to each other in a moment-to-moment basis, the entire organization will start to change. The culture will change. And sometimes that can kind of come down to just like a leader just like speaking to colleagues with like a little more respect or making sure that they listen a little bit more. And then that quality of listening will sort of trickle out through an organization and everyone just starts listening to each other more. And all of a sudden you have a collaborative functional system. And so, basically when I think of emergence, it's like something, a pattern that's happening because of like a small thing that's recurring a lot and a lot and a lot and all the connections.
I really love, Duncan, that perspective of like you just have to, especially the stitching analogy, like you just have to make a small shift and the whole structure changes, right?
Right.
And for us, what we do with organizations is we'll look at how we can shift the meeting, how people meet with each other. And that's like the small shift that we can make to help really impact the culture and the structure of the rest of the organization. And what we do is we'll create a meeting audit to really understand what kind of meetings people are having. What are people talking about? What are people not talking about in those meetings? Who's talking and who's not talking? What kind of topics are being covered and not being covered? And just making small tweaks about even just checking in with how folks are feeling at the beginning of a meeting, just a very small tweak to an existing meeting starts to create a different shape of culture, starts to affect the emergent property of what the culture of the company is in that moment.
Yeah. In your book, you have this part where you're like in the section where you're talking about culture and, like, it's like called culture of safety. And so you talk about like what is safety, what is culture, and then sort of like how to shift a culture to be more safe. And also there's a good section on fear too. But in the part where you're talking about culture, you also have an exercise that a leader can do or a practice that a leader can do to sort of think about how to implement something. And in the culture section, you have the leader visualize like if my team or my group or my organization was like a creature, like some sort of organism, what would it look like? What would it do? Like, what would it feel? What would it want? Like, what would it like start imagining this, like this kind of organism, this kind of beast of something, like, and then like imagining, because that's basically just imagine like the emergent quality of this thing and how could it change in this emergent way. And then those qualities of like that bigger organism then tell you about what are the qualities that I want to be able to interact with something.
I just think it might be fun if you and I talked about what that creature would be for our business.
Yeah.
Let's imagine that right now.
Right. Yeah. Well, I really I like this creature is dreamy, like it's like dreams a lot and like has a lot of great, visions and with like a lot of heart behind them. But then
Mm,
also is very skillful. Like, it's very like there's a lot of practical skills that this creature has. So
mm,
it's not just like dreaming, it's also able to it's very dexterous.
yeah. I'm feeling similar. I imagined almost like a lion cub in a
Mm-hmm.
big open field. And I think a cub because we're only a year old.
Yeah.
So we're still in that phase, but being very playful, but also, a predator, like somebody who's skillful and dexterous at hunting. And that's what it felt like to me.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely like the cat qualities I think are really interesting. That's like it's independent, yet like that level of like independence and it's like thinking in its like own way. I mean, just like having a cat, it's like one of the things I appreciate. It's just like it does not need anyone to tell it how to do its things. But then also just being like super skillful, like little ninja, but then also like having that quality of like, and now I'm gonna rest and I'm just gonna lay in the sun for like 4 hours, like like totally knows how to take care of itself.
But also really curious. And I know we still have a lot to learn and as we grow. And so there's
Mm-hmm.
that curiosity of and skill development for us as well.
Yeah.
Like, oh, there's more to learn. There's other skills that I don't know how to do yet, but other people know how to do. And as I grow, I'm going to learn how to do those.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm like inspired by, like, and just like learning, about us or as a possibility here from this lion cub metaphor is that, like they do like the play fighting
Yeah,
and
that's literally what I was imagining in my mind.
yeah, and it's like right, they're like learning the skills that it'll take to like do the things they're gonna do as they get older by creating like practice versions of that. It makes me think about how can we, I don't know, like interestingly like play and think of just like some sort of massive company. We could do like a mock spoken wheel program for like the U.S. government, or you know what I mean, or like just come, kind
I
of
would
like.
love that.
I mean, it seems like a really interesting way that we could like just because we have teams that we're already working with, and but we can. It'd be fun to play with that, and I also know that like an upcoming thing for us like super soon is to do our assessment like on ourselves.
Yes, yes. And so something that's initially not very tangible, right? Like, what is this culture? People talk about culture. Oh, it's values or it's norms, or we say it's relationships, right? How do you really kind of get a handle on it? And just like what we just did, just this imagining it as a creature, as something, makes it some kind of organism, right? Makes it come alive. And now we can start to pinpoint, oh, we have a little bit of this and we have a little bit of that. Whereas before it's previously it's a little bit, I think it's tough to even just conceptualize it. It's such an abstract term. Culture feels like a very abstract sort of term
Hmm.
for folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also, and so one of the things I also appreciate about your book is that like it's moving this dance between like this like individual and the team. And this is something that we also sort of believe a lot in our work, that
Yeah.
the way that individuals are thinking about their purpose and their relationships is reflected in how the team is thinking about its purpose in its relationships, and that fractal quality is something that's important. And so I'm also thinking about like individually noticing how I can both like dream into like my fierce grown lion capacity, and
Mm.
also like have compassion about how I'm kind of like clumsy and trip over my like big feet sometimes or something. And just like remembering to like be, that like I can also live those qualities, right?
Yeah.
Something you said earlier, you were talking about you're using this like metaphor of like a car and, like just kind of constantly correcting. And then we even mentioned Axel. I actually want to talk a little bit about why we call ourselves spoken wheel.
Mm.
This was a term that was up for you already.
Yeah.
And it was inspired by, was it like a poem by Mark Nepo or something?
Yes, it was a poem by Mark Nepo. And what really resonated for me in that specific poem that he wrote is that it does honor both the individual and the whole, that the the spokes in a wheel are represent the individual. Like we're all spokes, but we're connected in this hub to something greater. We're part of something greater. So we still can hold on to our individuality and yet are connected to something larger, which is the wheel itself. And furthermore, I think, especially let's take a bicycle wheel, for example, right? This each spoke has to have the right tension and carry its weight in order for the wheel to stay true and to be able to move straight, right? Like so that it can actually roll in a straight line. And so again, it's that dance between the individual and the responsibility each individual has, and that we're all interdependent, that we're all connected to this greater whole. And when we all work together, we can really roll. I guess we can really move fast. We can roll forward. I'm
Yeah.
curious for you, how, because I know you have a slightly different perspective on it. How does it resonate for you?
Well, I mean, it definitely, is something that like this part of the things that it emphasizes, definitely that like there's that coming together. I was always moved by, in Taoism, they talk about how it's like the space is what makes something useful. It's not the cup that's useful, it's like the space in the middle of the cup that makes the cup useful. And they also talk about how like that space in the middle of the axle in the center of the wheel is what makes it useful. That's like the thing that it can all move around. So that's like something that I think is like really powerful also. I mean, that space is in a way this like unspeakable kind of like the Tao, like this kind of unspeakable thing. And we talk a lot about just like having an organization needing to have like a life affirming purpose, and how like this is the reason for being, the reason for coming together that makes all of these spokes or these individuals sort of like unite, is something in a way that's beyond them. And in a way is a very sacred thing. And this also speaks to like making sure that like your whatever your work is doing something positive in the world. The other part about the spokes, though, as you said, is like each spoke at different moments either is on the bottom and is like getting compressed and like is under pressure, or is on the top and is like is holding tension. It's like it's either being pulled or pushed. And so you need to make sure that every spoke is taken care of and is strong and has the capacity for both tension and pressure, tension and compression. And there's another one of those Teamistry podcast episodes was talking about the team that made the spacesuits for the people who went to the moon for the first time. And basically, this is like a spaceship that the humans in, right? It has to be like super airtight and like protect you from the thing and keep you warm and just do all these things. So they have like these engineers with like all these crazy levels of things. But they had to get a team of seamstresses on there as well, like women who were like really good at sewing. And they also had, like a Black woman on the team, and it was like in the 60s. So it was like kind of a big deal. And what was interesting is that they made it really clear that the engineers were never talking down to the seamstresses. In order for them to be able to do this task, the seamstresses had to be like, look, if we like do a seam like this, it's going to tear. It can't be that way. And it required those who like knew all the engineering space stuff to be able to recognize the need to have expertise on their team that not only did they not have, but they didn't even know that they didn't have it, right? They don't know enough about sewing at all. And so they need someone there. And so created this like culture of like respect. But then also the way that they kept themselves focused was that they had pictures of the astronauts that were going to need to survive inside these suits. And so like always kept on coming back to like, this is keeping someone alive. Someone's life depends on this. It's not about my ego or your ego. And so like with the wheel, it's like they're all coming together around this, like we're going to create a life bubble for a human together, and all of us have to be really good at what we're doing. And I don't even know what you do, but you be good at that.
I love that they really kept the humanity close to them, that these are real people, real human beings that they're trying to keep alive in outer space.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we lose that connection if we're focused a lot on tasks in our day-to-day work, that there are real humans out there that our work impacts their life, like the quality of their life.
Yeah.
I love to read a little bit of the poem that Mark Nepo wrote, if I could,
Yeah.
that sparked, the name for me, which is Spoken Wheel. So Mark Nepo writes, imagine that each of us is a spoke in an infinite wheel. And though each spoke is essential to keeping the wheel whole, no two spokes are the same. The rim of that wheel is our living sense of community, family, and relationship. But the common hub where all the spokes join is the one center where all souls meet. So as I move into the world, I live out my uniqueness. But when I dare to look into my core, I come upon the one common center where all lives begin. In that center, we are all one and the same. In this way, we live out the paradox of being both unique and the same. For mysteriously and powerfully, when I look deep enough into you, I find me. And when you dare to hear my fear in the recess of your heart, you recognize it as your secret that you thought no one else knew.
Thank you for reading that.
And even in that, he talks about the paradox, which is the polarity of being both, that all of us are both unique and the same.
Hey, Fractal friends, sorry for the interruption here. I don't need to tell you much more about the work that I do because that's what you're listening to in this episode. But if you do want to get a hold of Alla and I, you can sign up for a free call or explore our resources at spokeandwheel.co. That's spokeandwheel.co. Okay, now back to the conversation. It's interesting, like the polarity thing's kind of become a problem for me because it definitely has that effect of like once you have a hammer, like everything looks like a nail. Like I just see it everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like what makes good story. It's part of, like we can find these kinds of tensions, all over the place. Episode that I'm going to put out on Tuesday is with Steve McIntosh, and he talks about like one of the key polarities is integration and differentiation.
Yeah.
And that's like something that cuts across like everything from like the Big Bang, to and atoms to cells and species and communities and organizations. And it's like we're constantly in this tension of like, I want to be individual. Like, oh, actually, I want to be in relationship and power and love all over again.
Yes.
Yeah. But this is really nice. Thank you for sharing that. I love how much that, like any good poem, it's like always growing on me, and it's like richer and has more meaning every time. Yeah.
Me too. And I haven't revisited it in a year, I think. And it's interesting because I definitely have a different experience with it today than I even did a year ago when we started.
Yeah. So we've talked a bit about, how we create this culture and how we, just like, and this quality of this emergent quality of culture and this individual and the group and relationships. I would love to talk more about just safety and why this is something that, has really come forward for you as something to pay attention to, and like why it actually is really important for organizations. And maybe just like a way to frame this is like, why do we care about, why would an organization really, or a leader like want to really care about safety? Like what are the dangers of people not feeling safe? Why do we care about safety?
Why do we care about safety? Well, although, a lot of our technology has evolved, especially in the last, 50 years, tremendously. At the end of the day, we're working with human beings, and our brains have not evolved that much over the last 10,000 years. And our brains are hardwired to help protect us, to keep us safe, meaning to ensure our survival. And what happens is when we're in a work environment that doesn't feel safe, we have mechanisms, neurological mechanisms in our brain that will work, unconsciously, instantaneously to help protect us. And that's many folks are familiar with the fight, flight, freeze, and faint response. So and our brain cannot tell the difference between a hungry lion trying to eat us and an angry stakeholder yelling at us or sending us an angry email. All of that is a threat to our brain. And so what happens in that moment is our brain will take resources and actually turn down the volume on the part of the brain that does thinking, that is creative, that can come up with, that can analyze, the rational part of our brain. Our brain will literally turn down the volume there. It will actually give it less blood supply, and it will regulate our system in such a way that it's ready to fight, flight, freeze, or faint. So it will take resources away from our thinking brain and put it towards surviving, towards protecting ourselves. And so literally, if you do not have an environment in your organization that feels safe for people, people's operating IQ, meaning the IQ that they use on a day-to-day basis, literally drops by half. So a normal operating IQ when somebody's feeling safe, when they're feeling calm, is about between 100 and 120 IQ points. When somebody doesn't feel safe, when that process kicks in, IQ literally drops in half to between 50 and 60 IQ points. So there's just no way that you're going to get the full intelligence of people, of the human beings on your team, if they do not feel safe. And also a lot of the work by Professor Amy Cuddy on psychological safety talks about how when folks don't feel safe, they're not going to speak up with new ideas that could have created additional value for your customers, a new product line for your business. Safety directly impacts companies' ability to service their customers and literally the company's bottom line. So in some effect, we just become dumb. Because, we just become dumb when we don't feel safe because our brain is using those resources not to think, but to stay alive. That's its main function, is to keep us alive.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've heard about this, 3 parts of the brain, lots of different times. But I'm really understanding kind of a new level right now is, especially if you've done the work to get a really great team of people together, right? You have these people, they're really smart. They have all these great skills. You got your seamstresses, you got your engineers, and you got them all, all together. The reason why you did that is because you want to be innovative, cutting edge, and be doing whatever that is you're trying to do in the world. Make your moon.
You want to do good work.
Yeah, you want to make it as great as possible. And you need that neocortex, that the human part of the brain, the mammalian part of the brain, this the thing that we have most developed as humans, to be fully operational, creative thinking, lateral thinking. And that only is working when we're feeling safe and respected and honored and so forth. And so then, and of course we have this wonderful survival brain, but the survival brain is trumps the thinking brain because surviving is way more important, evolutionarily and such. And it's interesting because you could imagine an organization, I've seen this before, being wow, we want people to work more. And so let's put them under some pressure, and let's give them some quotas, or let's give them, some deadlines, or let's criticize something that they did wrong. And all of these ways of trying to get someone to work better might get them to sort of maybe work harder, but it's not getting them to work better. And if you're acting in certain ways that are undermining people's safety. You're just like actually taking offline the part of their brain that is the reason why you have them there in the first place. And I think you also talk up in the book about like Taylorism and
Hmm.
and is it Frederick Taylor?
Yeah.
Yeah, that and just this idea of just like assembly lines. This idea like workers are just there to like do some function, and it's like really dark stuff about just like seeing these people as just like machines, and they don't really even know or care or have any of their own feelings. But it's interesting how we like still do that, where it's like if you treat your workers also like they are just doing some sort of function, like some sort of machine, then yeah, sure, you're not needing to rely on their creativity or their suggestions or their pieces. But in order to sort of really create the world that we want and to create this like beautiful, kind of workplaces where people are like joyful and engaged and doing things they love and like really serving the world, you need really everyone to be able to feel safe so that they can bring that innovative part of their brain.
Absolutely. And companies are paying so much money for these people, for the most talented people to come and work. And like we were mentioning before, how we work together is just as important as that talent. And part of that how is people feeling safe with each other. So it's being able to say to each other, hey, I really felt hurt by the comment that you made in that last meeting. Just wanted to clear that with you, instead of holding on to that resentment and then maybe even working against that individual in the future, which is ultimately working against your organization.
Yeah. What's interesting also that it like is just again in the way that like the individual reflects the organization. If you have someone feeling unsafe and their IQ is dropping, like you're also dropping away your like team's IQ.
Absolutely.
In a really good team, you want to have like that synergistic quality, right? So that the engineer can say like, this is what I need to happen. And the seamstress is like, look, I can tell you exactly the best way to do that, and he's like, oh, okay, cool. Let's do that, and like, yeah, like so that they can like actually build on each other. But if you are sitting there, someone saying like, I don't actually feel safe to be here. I'm not speaking up. Like if you think about each of like the individuals as like a neuron and like a bigger brain, like you're not like your team's IQ is lower. And you could imagine that also becoming like if the culture is something also where there's like competition or repercussions or resentment, like that could also downward spiral, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's also, from the story that you said about the engineers and the seamstresses, it was important that nobody was looked down upon, right? That each contribution,
Mm-hmm.
each skill set was valued. But let's say the engineers did, for example, devalue the seamstresses and they're like, oh, they're just lowly seamstresses, for example. Then the seamstresses would not feel safe then to speak up when the engineer said, well, I need this thing. And then they would say, okay, well, it has to be like this. And then you're just like, no, it has to be like that. They're like, okay. And then they wouldn't say anything. They wouldn't fight, like they wouldn't push back. And that would literally endanger the life of the astronaut.
Yeah, exactly. And then Neil Armstrong goes up there and he like turns to take a picture and this thing rips open and
Yeah,
yeah, and it's like the worst day of history.
exactly. But then they really wouldn't, if they didn't feel that their expertise, their ideas were respected, were included, were really heard, they
Yeah.
would not offer that.
Yeah, and I think this is like and this is like super important, especially as like organizations get larger and larger, like the leadership is not on the front lines, right? You can
Yeah.
imagine the people like in the boardroom, they are not in the store at the edge of the retail outlet talking to the customers. And like that person who's like just on the front lines talking to customers about something, like they're going to have ideas about like, you know what, like putting this here doesn't make sense, or like people keep returning this darn thing. And if that person doesn't feel like that they matter, like if that spoke isn't strong enough, and they're just like, whatever, I'm out of here, this place sucks, like they've lost that information. And instead, by creating that culture of sort of safety, and the way you create that is also by just like creating these relationships that where people know that someone's got their back, and that it's like okay for them to speak up, and that they are valued and they're honored. And there's so many different pieces to that. Yeah. What are some of the things that you like? What are some of the indicators that like one might see in an organization if like people aren't really feeling safe, or that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, some of kind of going back to the meeting discussion we had earlier, why we look at meetings specifically is this is where people will show up and will show you whether they've, those interactions and meetings is the best indicator of, if people feeling safe. So for example, if people don't ask many questions during meetings, there's just one person doing most of the talking. If the executive or team leaders dominate the meeting discussions, it's an indicator it's not a very safe relationship because nobody's speaking back up. If the team avoids difficult conversations in meetings, or just even between two people with each other, then they don't feel safe to have those conversations. If in meetings people start to place blame on others for mistakes, oh, it's those seamstresses' fault, they didn't do their job, or it could be, it's the sales department's fault, or it's the developers that are wrong in all of this. That's an indicator that there isn't really a lot of safety there. People don't ask for help from one another when they need it.
Mm-hmm.
People don't venture outside of their department or even maybe their job description. Well, that, if you hear that, well, that's not my job. That's a huge indicator that there isn't a sense of safety in the workplace. Or, they need to collaborate with somebody in a different department. They need that input, but don't seek that out, but don't actually, create a relationship with that individual. They don't feel safe to do that.
Yeah.
But interestingly, if there actually aren't any disagreements on the team, if there isn't any conflict, that means people don't feel safe to have it. And that's a very, very big indicator that there isn't any conflict because people don't feel safe to disagree with each other, to say, well, I don't think that's going to work, to push back, right? To say, oh, I think we're headed in the wrong direction or a dangerous direction. Have you thought of X, Y, and Z, right? And so I guess the biggest indicator is how much silence there is. If there isn't many questions, if people aren't speaking up, if they're not disagreeing with each other, they're not asking for help, the larger the silence, the more unsafe an environment is.
Yeah, that's really powerful. A long time ago, in college, I guess, I had this observation that that there's a certain balance for people to speak up of like passion and confidence, right? Like if someone cares a lot about something and they're like afraid, like they'll speak up about it. And then there's like also like if they like feel really like I feel super secure in myself, I'll speak up about anything even if I don't really care that much, But I'm just like noticing that like that's missing an ingredient, which is like the culture or the system that you're in, like is a huge part of that, right? And so there's a way that a good culture is going to both like get people to care about the thing, so they know like, wow, you know what, I'm going to take responsibility for this, or I'm going to take responsibility for speaking up, and it's both instilling passion and confidence. And in your book, you had this great story of Captain Marquette, who's this U.S. submarine captain, and he gets like put on this. He gets like transferred from like a submarine to like the worst performing, jankiest U.S. submarine in the fleet or something, and he's like and then just like starts the job like right away, and he has this strategy that shifts this like whole culture. Like, do you feel like you could speak to that story? Yeah.
Oh, it's my favorite story. I absolutely can speak to it. So Captain Marquette, he studied a specific submarine, the USS Olympia, for an entire year. So he knew how that submarine worked inside and out, right? All the functions of the submarine. And in the last minute, when he was supposed to go, be the captain of that ship, he got reassigned to a different ship, the USS Santa Fe. And that ship was ranked the absolute lowest in the entire Navy. It had the lowest reenlistment rate in the Navy. It was it just was the worst performing ship in the entire Navy fleet. He didn't know anything about that submarine, how that submarine worked. And he had no control over the people that were on that submarine. He couldn't fire anybody or replace anybody. And he had no control over what role they played on that submarine. So the engineer was the engineer, and whoever that person was who that person was. Like, he just had no control over that. The only control he had was how he related to each individual. And so what he did, which is very different for the Navy, was to give the power of decisions back to the people who are on the submarine, who actually know how the submarine worked. So instead of giving orders, which was very normal which is how people, operate in the Navy, the captain gives orders and people follow the orders.
Right.
He couldn't give the orders because he did not know how the ship worked. Like, literally, the technologically, mechanically, how the ship worked. He could not do it.
Well, and he recognized that, which is powerful.
He recognized that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And normal leaders might try to fake it till they make it, kind of approach. I think that would be normal, to be like, oh, I'm the captain, I have to figure it out, and I have to put on a face like I do know what I'm talking about. And that could actually endanger a lot of people on the ship. Although that would have been a strategy that some leaders would have gone. Instead, he decided to give the power to the people that actually know what's going on. And so he said, if I'm not going to give any orders, if you want to do something on the ship, you come to me and you say, Captain, I intend to immerse the ship. And he will say, yes, okay. And then you go forth and you do that, you do your job. And this created, and so his whole goal was to create safety on the ship. Because he did not know how the ship operates, he wanted people to feel safe to take action based on their expertise. And so this was very weird for the crew, for the first month or so, right? They're like, we're used to taking orders. What do we do? And so they would come to him and they would say, well, can we do this? And he would say, well, if you were the captain, what kind of information would you need to make that decision? He didn't make the decision for them, right? Or he could say, well, express that in probabilities. What's the probability of this going well versus not well? He helped people think through it. He didn't show down any idea that anyone had. And through this process, what ended up happening is people had to start working, like different stations in the submarine. People had to start working with each other and communicating with each other because there wasn't this one person telling them what to do. And so what ended up happening is everybody on the ship, which never happened before, everybody on the ship knew what was going on at every other station on the ship. And so because they had to coordinate with each other and make those decisions, and they felt safe enough after a certain period of time to come to the captain and say, okay, we intend to do this. We talk to, the engineering team, or we talk to this other team that we need to talk to. And, we're all in alignment with what needs to happen. And then he would just be like, okay, then go do that. Right. He was just basically a final gut check on it.
Right.
And what ended up happening by him creating the safety, by letting people be safe and taking action, helping them think through that action, helping them coordinate with other people in other stations, right? This, in 2 years' time, this ship became the number one ranked ship in the Navy. It had 100% reenlistment rate, and it actually broke Navy records for performance.
Wow.
So it went from last to Navy record breaking first.
Yeah.
And it's funny because all of the other captains would call up Marquette, and they would be like, what, you must be giving some great orders. Like, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm not giving any orders. And they're like, what? What are you talking about? And that was the big change. He wasn't giving any orders. He was creating safety for people to be able to think at their 100%, at 100% IQ level, at their highest operational IQ level, and trusted them to do their job.
I really love that story, and I love hearing the audio version of it too. And there's like a couple things like sort of like hidden in that story. I think they're just like super important. Like one is that he was teaching people how to lead, right?
Yeah.
Like, so they were coming to him and saying, can I do this or whatever? And so he helped them say like, okay, well, what other information do you need to be able to do this? Like what do you think the probabilities are? So he's like helping them consider like what are the kinds of things that he might be considering, because maybe
Right.
Obviously he's like trained and as a captain and has maybe certain skills, and so he's helping them like develop these skills. But then what the kind of end product is just creating again like this organism, and of course like turning a ship into like a interactive organism is like a very powerful thing, right? Because that way, if they're in crisis or, under attack or something like that, the people who are, in the engine or people who are in the whatever are able to be like, oh, I know exactly what to do and I know how to get the information I need about what to do here, so that you could have that confidence, in that space. What I think was also interesting is that like he had to like these people at first were like, I don't know if I can do this, right? Because like they were already so disempowered. So he had to get them to sort of overcome their fear of their own capacity.
Yeah. And this is I think this is my biggest aha in writing the book and related to the work that we're doing. And my biggest aha is, as leaders, the number one job as a leader is to be able to feel calm and centered and regulated in yourself, so that when other people come to you and they feel afraid, like because of the way our brains work, we have mirror neurons, like their nervous system can calm down and they can have access to their full intelligence. And they do that just by being around, literally just being in the same presence, in the same room next to someone who feels calm, who feels centered, who's regulated themselves. This is the core work of leadership, is learning how to regulate your own nervous system. So that you can lead and help regulate others, so they can have access to their full intelligence, and then collectively the team can have full access to their intelligence and take the action or create something together that the business is trying to create. And this was my big realization of really what true leadership is that. So I think that's what he was teaching folks.
Yeah.
To trust themselves, to feel confident, to feel centered, to know how to regulate their fears and their nervous system so that they can access all the knowledge and all the intelligence that they have, and then therefore become leaders to others.
Yeah, it's such a powerful insight. And also, there's like a deep lesson in life, which is like, if you want to really help someone, change or something like that, well, first of all, just make sure that like you got that quality going on in yourself, right? Like you have to do the inner work.
Yes.
First, before you can expect other people to do it. And then just actually having made the personal change is the kind of most of the work that you need to do to help other people change, because it's going to be the thing that really helps them. You're becoming like a living model of this. And I think what's interesting about this fear piece, and it's something you said in the book that was a kind of an insight for me, was just the act of changing the culture of your organization, going against the grain of a century of command and control leadership and starting to think about how do we be more relational, or how do we create space for emotions. For a leader, that's scary. And as a leader trying to sort of make change in how you operate your organization, you will run into fear. So in the very process of changing, your capacity to be courageous in the face of something that's scary and to also be calm. And I think this is really great. Where like fear helps you slow down like it's just like a reminder to be like, regulate yourself, like take this seriously, calm down. And I know, you're like influenced a lot by Brene Brown. Well, I am, everyone is at this point, but like, but like that idea is like that courage is not about not being afraid. It's about like being afraid and then moving and then being through it. So it's like, it took a lot of courage for that captain to do that. And that was part of what he was demonstrating.
Yes.
To be able to say, like, I actually don't really know what to do.
Yes.
And so
I think this speaks to me about the three types of relationships that all of us are always in. And it's the relationship to ourselves. Number one, how do we think about and feel and behave towards ourselves? Right. And this is what I'm saying is the core work of leadership is to get into right relationships with ourselves first. Right. So that we can have great relationships one-on-one with people, right? With individuals, other individuals that we work with, and then have a great relationship to the team or to your organization as a whole. And so relationships are fractal in that way. And it starts with shifting the relationship. As leaders, it starts with shifting the relationship to yourself, one other, and then to a team, and then to an organization. And I think it's important to talk about that. And I think in many businesses, people understand their relationships are important, but don't really have any strategies or mechanisms for how to work on that, how to improve that, how to shift that when you're not in right relationship with either yourself or others that you're working with. And I think that's the core of what we offer in the work that we do.
Yeah. For a good time now, talking about just like the fractal nature of conflict, I just love pointing out that it's like, this is same thing across like all these different scales, but the internal one is the one that's easiest to miss. And I would say, like, as a mediator, oftentimes a lot of like the secret work that's happening is like helping someone actually, the individual, figure out why they care about whatever the issue is. Like, because they're having their own internal thing, and that process of sort of externalizing like whatever the problem is to, like, this is the problem or this is the person. But like
the person is the problem, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's like a very common thing. And and like part of the work is to get, wait, this other person is actually someone's in relationship with you, and the problem is another thing. The two of you have to figure out how to do together. But before that, can you even understand why you care about this? Like, why is this important to you as an individual? And what internal conflict do you have about it? And can you reconcile your own internal conflict about this first? Because otherwise, it's going to be hard for you to expose yourself to this other person, right?
Yeah.
And it's going to actually be necessary that you actually are able to do this. One of the great questions that like Ken Cloak and also like people in the Essential Partners, which used to be called the Public Conversations Project, have is this question of like, can you consider what are the edges of like your opinion about something that you aren't totally sure about? I mean, it's a very vulnerable question to ask someone to admit to someone else, but even for someone just to admit to themselves, like, I actually don't, I can really believe this, but I recognize that, like, I'm not really sure about this part of it, or, like I have, like, or I know that I've acted differently than I actually think I'm supposed to act, like those pieces. The question that I ask everyone on the show is, given your life experience, the windy path of Alla, what is something that you might invite people to pay attention to as they're trying to make a better world for themselves and for others?
And this may be because this is what we just talked about, but really the first thing that comes to my mind is how am I to pay closer attention to how you're relating to yourself, how you're thinking, feeling, and behaving towards yourself. And I just find that people are often so harsh, so mean, abusive, sometimes even to themselves. And it breaks my heart. And I want people to relate to themselves in a loving, respectful, caring way, because that will, again, in this fractal nature, ripple out to everyone else. So pay attention to how you're relating to yourself.
Have a nice day.
And my wish is with compassion.
Yeah. Yeah, that compassion for self. I've said a lot of times. I can't remember how I figured this out, but it was definitely, through a journey of compassion. But it was something about like self-forgiveness is kind of the solution to everything,
Yeah.
in a way that it's like, okay, can I just like give myself, forgiveness for my flaws, and just like, which creates space for me to be able to improve, to find that equanimity, that calm in the face of fear, and then becomes a demonstration for those around me. And if I actually understand the process I've gone through, I can maybe even show other people about that. They get to make their own changes because they have to go through their own journey of self-compassion. And then you could
Mm.
imagine like this mirror neurons, and we ripple out. Then you have like this team and this group that is now working well, finding their own internal sense of compassion and care, and getting things done and making them this effective good team. And then of course maybe like that team and the wider organization, like that can ripple out to that organization, and like that organization is part of like a network of businesses and companies, and then that has the ability to ripple out, like just kind of bringing it full circle. It's like this is how the world gets changed. And like, given that work is the thing we spend most of our time at of all, like, if we can change the way we are with ourselves, we can change the way we are with our teams, we can change the way we are with our work, how we relate to the world, and
With our families and our communities, where we live, and our planet.
yeah. And I think like one of the things that's like not so obvious sometimes is like the way that the world changes, or like people change the world, is by showing that they've come up with like a way better way of doing something than what's already happening.
Yeah. I believe that we have.
Yeah.
You and I have, and I want to share that with the world.
Yeah, I think it's powerful stuff. So let's see, if folks want to get in touch with us, how do they do that?
They go to www.spokeandwheel.co, and there are certainly contact forms there that folks can use, and they can email us. It's pretty easy. It's either Duncan@spokeandwheel.co or Alla@spokeandwheel.co. We look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah. I also encourage folks to poke around. We're like continuing to like add more goodies and resources there. And there's like a Learn With Us page with different videos. And we have this really great, effective communication tool. There's actually links to Fractal Friends episodes that are very specific for spoken wheel audiences. And it's the best way to get on our newsletter and stay tuned for Alla's book that's coming out. And we're putting together all sorts of great little tools. And, we offer free calls. So folks are welcome to reach out, and no pain just to like get on the call with us and talk about, your team or a group or organization, whoever you are. If you want to do something great in this world and you want to do it with other people, we got your back. Thank you, Alla.
Thank you. Awesome.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of Fractal Friends with Alla Weinberg. You can find more content, links, and resources about this episode, as well as other episodes at fractalfriends.us. And while you're there, sign up for the newsletter and get updates on new episodes, as well as learn more about Alla's and my work as Spoken Wheel. Also, please consider donating to Fractal Friends or subscribing to become a patron. You can find buttons for that on the website. You can find out more about Alla and myself and our work at spokeandwheel.co. And if you like this episode, please take a moment to share it with someone. Text it to a colleague. Share it with your friends. Share it on LinkedIn or Facebook. Send an email. Tell your mom about it. I'm doing my part to amplify these voices, and I would love to have your support in spreading the word. And as usual, I'm going to close this out with a song. The song I want to share with you is called You Are Always Held, and it is by my friend Joyous Dawn. I'm happy to share her beautiful music with you, because it is a profound reminder of how much we all long to be held in love. Thank you for listening to Fractal Friends. And remember, we all have a role to play in the whole. Have a nice day.
You are always held. You are always held. You are always held. always have.